We're all familiar with fish that are predators. I actually think obviously most of them are carnivores, but I do think roach are vegetarians. They love hemp and wheat and corn and things like that. But I'm not vegetarian because you don't get a figure like this by not eating meat. One of my favourite foods is meat. But I also believe in this river there's some chub, and they also love mince and steak. And years ago I came onto the river float fishing on a pleasure day with my dad, and I probably had one of the best days fishing I've ever had, with a catch of 60 odd chub. I even had some skimmers that day down at Winthorpe downstream. But we've returned back to the river some years later, where I know that the chub population is a little bit lower, but I think by feeding raw mince through a little bit of breadcrumb and with some raw steak on the hook on a float, running it down just below the outfall here at the famous Burton Joy stretch, we're in for a cracking day. The whole concept of, in my mind, feeding mince is that it's the blood and the meat that they actually want. So I'm going to try and keep it as natural, i.e. the mince being the most important and prominent part of my mix. So all I'm going to add to it is a bit of binder in the form of some brown crumb. So that's my mince, blood and everything, as much as we can out of the packet. And by adding brown crumb as a binder, that'll do two things. One is break it all up a little bit, and then allow me to be able to create a ball which I can then throw in to the swim. I was going to use that to, I'm no Nigella Lawson, but, and I'm certainly not Gordon Ramsay, because I don't swear enough really, but this I'm going to use to break it up, and I'll just add a little bit at the start. You can see I'm just rubbing that through my fingers, getting that bread in between the mince, and you can see that's actually growing as we separate all the meat. We can see the blood going into that bread already. And I'll add a little bit more bread as we get it loosened up, so that I'm not putting too much bait into the swim. And the beauty about bread is that every fish loves it, especially chub, which hopefully will be attracted to the blood and taste of this meat. I mean, I can smell that, obviously raw meat, and they will, but I'm hoping that that bread doesn't put them off, it actually attracts them. There's a lot of birds on this section, a lot of swans and geese, which I know get fed just up by the pub upstream, and I'm sure they know what bread is. So hopefully the combination of them two should make this a brilliant bait. So it's going to take a bit of work, but it'll be worth the effort. So I've been rubbing that through my fingers, and I'll be honest with you, we're hard work, and I'm not up for that this time in the morning. So I've got the old drill out, and I think the chef, my favourite, Martin, handsome fella, he calls it tenderising. James Martin's the fella we're looking for. He'd be proud of that, wouldn't he? Look at that now. So that means I can make it into a ball, which will sink, but it'll break up because I've got that crumb inside it, without losing, because I've only put 2 handfuls of bread in a full pack of meat. So look at that now. You can smell it, the fish will be able to taste it, and the attraction coming off that hopefully will be irresistible. By using that drill, that's just made it a lot easier, but as you saw at the beginning, you can do it with your hands, it just takes a little bit longer. And that bread is now fully integrated with that meat, separating it and creating a mix that will break up, but one that I can squeeze to a nice tight ball to get to the bottom. So obviously we've got a bit of flow here, and then it should break up nice and simply, and then the fish will be able to get to that. And then to complement that, obviously we're going to need something for the hook, which will be I'm not going to say prime steak, because it's not 28-day aged Angus, whatever it is, long gone, but it's a nice piece of bloody meat, which is quite tough. And what I'll actually do is just cut little slithers off, like so, and I'll be able to hook them like that, and hopefully that'll be irresistible to the carnivorous chaps that are hopefully swimming up and down in this swim. So we sat ourselves down a couple of pegs down from the famous outfall on this Burton Joyce road stretch, which was synonymous for match fishing. Lots of float anglers used to come here. It was a bit of a mecca. Roach and chub, back in the day there were lots of them. We know there's less of those fish in the river now, but the ones that are left, the chub, are predominantly bigger. So I'm going to try and tackle it today with the float, and I've had a little run through just to get a feel for the river, and it's quite boily. There's a little bit of pace on, a little bit more than we hoped, and a tinge more colour than we would have liked for fishing this kind of bait. Maybe it would have been a great day to fish a lobworm, but nonetheless we've brought ourselves down and we're going to give it a whirl. So I'm tackling it with a 4 gram and a 6 gram because there's a bit of a boil on the water. I'm going to try and get that running through. We're going to feed some of this mince through this ground bait and then see if we can get some of these fish. So we'll talk you through how we're fishing it and how we're tackling it, and feel his way through the session. I'm going to have to tighten that clutch up a little bit. So that just went under where I thought there were a snag, because my float's been dragging there a little bit. And I mean, this is incredible. Even I'm shocked, because we've only been fishing about 15 minutes, running that float through. And I probably fed 5 or 6, maybe 8 balls, and you can see how swelly that river is, and how beginning to think that we were just on the wrong day, because it's hard to make the float ride properly. But sure enough, it's gone under, and I felt that reassuring nod of what I'm presuming is a chub, because he's a meat eater. And I've got to be honest with you, the adrenaline that's going through me, because this is dead exciting. I don't know if it's a bit of nostalgia. I don't know if it's just that natural excitement of a natural venue where you're looking at a massive river and presuming that you're not going to catch anything, because look at it. And sure enough, with a little bit of steak hanging out the front of his mouth, there we are. That's a Trent chub, and he's not a small fish either. On float tactics, on a cold river, supermarket bait, what is not to love about that? Now that's been worth getting up this morning for, I can tell you. Right in the edge of the mouth as well. I'm just gonna hook that up so I don't get fast. He is pristine as well. That's not an old fish. That's, I'm going to say, a fairly young fish, and probably not been caught before. What an absolute beauty. But let's hope it's the first of many. I mean, when that just went under then, and obviously I've lifted into it, and you get that thump, excitement's not the word. Well, I don't know if that were a bit of weed or not. That's because I'm rattling and trying to fish at the same time. That could have been another chub. Yeah, the excitement when you lift into a prime fish like that. I mean, these fish aren't tame, they pull back. And I were giving it as much as I could, because I know that there's a few snags. And chub have got that nasty habit of finding them. Now, I've obviously I'm not fishing super light, but the rod's not over strong, So I had to kind of lean into it a bit, but the excitement I went through then when that went under and we were attached to a submarine, as we used to call them, well, I can't hide it, can I? Look at him, I'm grinning like a Cheshire cat. Now you can tell from my rosy red nose and my rosy red cheeks it's not particularly warm, and that's because it's December and it's cold, and that's kind of what made me choose, well, I've waited really most of the summer for this cooler weather to come to fish this bait, because personally the target fish is chub, without a doubt. You might catch a barbel on it, you know, you might catch an odd other fish, but ultimately chub is the game. And I think this comes into its own in winter on the river. I'm sure you might catch fish on it in the summer, you know, they're probably more active. But for me, the feeling is that the river's going to be cold and clear. As it happens today, I thought we'd picked the wrong day because there's a bit of extra water in the river. It's about a foot up, might be 18 inches up with flood water. And it's got quite a bit of pace on it. And out in the main river, it's quite coloured. Now, where we're fishing here, there's a bit of clear water because the outflow that's coming in here probably amounts to about 30%, 20% of the passing flow of the river. So we've kind of got a bit of clearish water in front of us, but I think it's a clear water bait, and I also think it's a cool water bait. So if you're looking for something to fish, some way of fishing this time of year, I'd recommend that you kind of wait and savour those moments, because if you're looking for a big chub, there's no better way to catch them. Now this one don't feel as big. This one were right down the swim, because I was thinking that I've got to make sure that, I'm saying it weren't as big, I think it's probably strained itself out. And this is only the third run down after the first one, which I don't want to count my chickens, but could this be a fantastic session? We've got the river to ourselves, obviously, because for whatever reason, I don't know if people think the river's flooded, I don't know if it's gone out of fashion, everybody's fishing on commercials. But we've got it to ourselves here, and that one has definitely realised that there's some rocks and some vegetation on the inside, and he's pulling back. But yeah, so we've got the whole river to draw these fish up from, and that one we're quite a way down the swim. Unlike the first one, which I would say was probably right on top of where I would like to think my bait's landing. I mean, I've gone out as far as I can this morning, stood out into the river, because there's extra water in it. Obviously it's going to be a struggle to reach past these snags, but with this is a 15-foot rod, and with my short arms I'm just managing to keep it somewhere above, and I have to pull a bit harder probably. And that is another fantastic fish. Well, I was definitely in two minds this morning whether this would be a successful day out or not. And I'm going to be honest with you, if we don't catch another one, I'm going to call it a success. They're obviously eating it. I've just had a little glimpse in there, and sure enough, the loose feed, or the mince ground bait, is right in its throat, so they can taste it, they can smell it, and they clearly want it. What a bait. So we've had a few runs down, and we've obviously had a couple of fish, and when we first started, one of my first considerations were, I mean, it's over 10 foot deep. I've actually added a little bit of water to the mix just to try and add a bit more weight to it, because I'm very conscious that it's got to get down. Now, the thing about float fishing on a river is that it's mega important that your float and your hook is all fishing, and what I mean by that is that it's ready, it's settled, it's moving at the right pace, it's not still falling, you've not got your line's got to be behind your float, and that's all got to happen in the bait area. That was bottom that way. In the area where in my imagination, where the bait's hitting the bottom, breaking up, and it's like a target area. Now, unlike stillwater fishing, the fish are on the move, but ultimately there'll still be a prime bullseye in that area where the most of your bait is concentrated. Because if you keep throwing your bait in the same place, ultimately, apart from an odd bit of deviation and fluctuation in the flow, which we've got quite a bit of today, most of the bait should travel sort of diagonally down the swim and then arrive somewhere at the bottom, mostly in the same place. So finding your target area, because of course it's a bit of a trial and error when you're running a float through, that's where you'll see that most of the fish are. Now, we've only had 2 bites and we might not get tons of bites, so it might be hard to identify that. So you've got to kind of use your intuition a little bit. And so what I'm getting at is that I've added a bit more water to the mix to make sure that I'm in control of how sort of fast it sinks, how hard the balls are, so that in this flow I can get them to the bottom and make sure that it's somewhere, and I'm going to say a third of the way down my swim, because even though this is 6 grams, it's still taking a little while to settle up, is the term I'm going to use. And what I mean by that is that where I think the rig's settled, the hook's obviously sunk. I've got 5 number 8s below the Olivette to create myself a bit more stability. I want a bit of flexibility. I don't want my Olivette really tight down because I think it gives that bit of slack. So I've got those shots. I want those to have settled. I want my hook to have settled. And then I want it to be running over the top of where I think my bait is. If all that is happening past your bait, the chances are it's going to reduce your catch rate massively. So where you feed on a flowing river is really important. And I'm not going to say there's a textbook formula. You've got to feel your way into it. So the fish are likely to come right up because they're greedy and they're swimming along, and they're obviously in this flow and they're swimming upstream all the time, and they're inclined to swim up to your bait and past it. Chub, roach do it, they come up in the water. I mean, the worst culprits are dace, and they'll actually, if there was somebody fishing above you feeding and their bait was coming through, obviously down in the flow, they're likely to go up what they call like a bait ladder, because they can keep going and going and going, and they finish up miles upstream. So what I'm trying to do is determine if I'm feeding high enough or low enough to make sure that I can run my hook bait over the top of the bullseye in the target area. I know that's a long way of getting around to telling you that, but there's all sorts going off, and it's important to consider it. And it might mean that as the session goes on, you have to change what you're doing. And by that, you might have to change how hard you squeeze that so it goes down faster. You might want to put a bit in that does break up quickly mid-water to send a scent down the river to attract a few fish. But my opinion, more often than not, is the easiest way to catch fish is to concentrate them, whether that be on the bottom, sometimes near the surface by changing how you feed, but on the bottom is ordinarily the most effective way of catching fish, because you can use weights, lead, Olivettes, to sink your bait and you know where it's at. Whereas if you're trying to sort of run bait off the bottom, your loose feed is only going to be off the bottom in a certain place because ultimately it sinks. So try and get it so you know where it's sunk. Make sure you've got that target area, find your bullseye, alternate what you're doing, how you're feeding it, to suit where you're getting your bites. Now, all that's well and good when you're getting plenty of bites. We've had 2, we might have had 2.5 actually, I'm not sure. I think one we maybe missed a bite, but we caught him next chub, because that's the thing about chub, they can't help themselves. They're nearly as greedy as me. And sure enough, after I thought I'd missed a bite, I went down and caught one. So I'm not going to call that reading your swim, because unless you're getting plenty of bites, you won't have a chance to read it, because you're not getting enough clues. You're not getting that bread trail off the fish to lead you to a conclusive decision. So I'm throwing it downstream, a couple of rod lengths, so I'm hoping then it's landing somewhere now where my float is. You saw me cast it in, where my float is, because that gives it enough time to settle up. So depending on depth, depending on flow, depending on what you feed, because of course loose feeding, for instance maggots or casters or something like that, would be completely different. This is balls of ground bait, which is unusual really, isn't it, for trotting. But that's the best way of getting this mince to the bottom. So all sorts of different circumstances will lead to you doing different things. But that's the beauty of fishing, isn't it, that 2 days are never the same, which is what the attraction is, I'm convinced of it. Because if they were the same every day, somebody would master it and then all the fun would go out of it. And even after all my long hours on the bank, it just goes to show you there's still a bit of excitement when you hook a wild fish, especially a chub. Sorry to interrupt your viewing of this fantastic video, but we just wanted to mention that we've had some amazing feedback lately about our videos, and you know, some of the comments are really complimentary, and we work really hard to keep the videos as good as we do. Now, I just want to point out that all our videos are completely free of charge. We don't charge a subscription, but what we would like you to do in return for that favour is that we'd like you to subscribe to our channel. And if you do subscribe to us, we promise to make sure that we'll double down and make these videos better and more interesting for you. Do you know, they're amazing, chub, because all of a sudden it looks like that one's snagged, but it's just sat, probably with its mouth open, in the floor, wondering. It's probably more surprised than I am. And I just held on to that float, just held it back, which caused it to swing in to the edge a little bit. And the minute I let it go, it's probably because the chub had already got in its mouth. The minute I let the tension off, the float was gone. And we've hooked another. This one definitely knows how to put a fight up. He's holding himself out in that float, and I'm actually giving these fish a bit more stick, I'm applying a bit more pressure than I would normally like to, but because I can't get over the top of these marginal snags, I know these fish are not stupid and they'll definitely find them, and we'll finish up being hooked up to a Nottinghamshire bit of tree rather than a beautiful Trent chub. That one weren't ready, was it? Look at him. He was not ready. A slightly bigger fish. That's considerably bigger fish actually. And that is a big chub. In fact, until I've got the hook out, I won't be lifting him up because he's a cracker. And that is an absolute beautiful fish. I don't know what he weighs. He's £5 plus. It's got to be. But I'm going to give myself £5 for him because I'm not going to weigh him. But look at that for a fish. On float tactics. What more could you want? He certainly likes me, doesn't he? So as I mentioned a little bit earlier, I added some water to that initial mix that I made up in the big bucket because I don't think there was as much blood and fluid in that meat as I probably anticipated. So I dropped a ball in the edge before I started throwing it into the mighty Trent, and it was a little bit buoyant. So that's because there wasn't enough moisture in the meat. And so what I'm actually doing is I've got my big bowl on my side tray here, and I've got a smaller bowl which I'm just using to control enough to fish with for probably an hour or so. And I've just added a bit of water to that, which obviously adds weight to it. It's helping it to bind and making sure it's getting it to the bottom, because that bread were probably a little bit dry. I'll just try a bit of edge here. Yeah, it's still a bit buoyant. I'm just going to put a bit more in that. Just worth trying that little bit in edge, just to make sure that, because you don't want to start feeding these and they finish up at Gunthorpe Way, which is about 4 miles downstream. What would be the point in that? You'll never catch them. So don't just presume. Always check what you're doing and think about, obviously there's quite a bit of fat in mince, which is probably why they minced it, because it weren't good enough to be the steak that we're putting on the hook. And fat's buoyant. I'd probably float if I fell in. And added to that bread, which obviously wasn't wet enough because there wasn't enough blood, we've just needed to tweak it a little bit. So that's just another little mix to take us through the next hour, and probably hopefully another 3 chub. And that's another fish, and that's interesting because I'd been a bit lazy and probably overexcited because I caught them fish, and I'd not fed as consistently because I'd run out of, I was getting low on mix, so I was feeding a bit less sparingly. Anyway, I've just wet that stuff up and made a fresh batch for the feeding bowl, and after 3 or 4 balls and a couple of runs down, sure enough I've got one. Because of course, even if they've not eaten it all, the fish are attracted to that scent, and it's fresher when it's going in than it is when it's been in there a while. So it's important to keep feeding. This feels like another big fish, a little bit like the last one, more out in the floor. And yeah, he's kicking ears. And you've just got to remember that there's a lot of floor. These big fish, they're probably eating that one mouthful, that bowl. They're obviously hungry for it. So by getting lazy and getting excited, I've not kept up my constant feed. So just remember that. It's important, because they're coming to the bait clearly. It's obviously what they want. And when fish are coming to a bait like this that is clearly quite an aggressive bait, then that means they want it. You know, you're not just nicking a few fish, they're actually coming to eat it. That's a cracking fish. He's a different fish altogether. More powerful. Look at him. Just big, old Trent chub. And I'm saying he's old. The first 2, I think, were really young fish. The second one looked a bit older. There we go. He's getting up for £4. Fit as a fiddle, that one. Probably not a brand new fish, a few scars on him, but a fantastic fish. Beautiful. Can't believe how many we're catching. So obviously this bait has been quite effective today, and I just want to do a bit closer detail on what we've actually got here. So that is a pack of 500 grams, which is just over £1, of beef mince. Now obviously we're fishermen and we're going to be throwing this into the lake, and the river, and therefore we don't really be paying top dollar. So this is not prime beef mince, it's supermarket mince. But what I'll try to look for is to make sure there's enough blood and enough redness in it. So yes, you know, price is a factor, but the attraction of this bait is quite clearly the meat and the blood and the smell, because these fish are obviously predators. The chub that we've caught today are homing in on this smell. So I think it's really important. And you know, the hook bait's a slightly different thing, because combining that, we've actually got some shin beef or stewing beef. If you're lucky enough and you've had steak last night, cut yourself a bit off before you cook it. And so we've got this raw red meat, and what I've actually done is took a piece and cut some off with the scissors and created these little slithers and sort of cubey small, and that's as big. I mean, I've got massive hands, so it's probably hard to scale it, but that's my little fingernail there, look, and it's half the size of that. And I'm just hooking that up like a maggot, but making sure that I've got sort of into the bones of it, if you like. And you might have to sort of put your hook through twice so that you make sure it's on. But you can. The beauty of this is you can leave your hook clean with this bait like you would with a maggot, and a little piece like that it's a perfect hook bait. I think if I were fishing with on feeder or on a ledger, I'd probably be inclined to put a slightly bigger piece on because I'll be sitting and waiting. But while I'm running through on a float with these bits of mince that you'll obviously have seen me earlier when I mixed it all up, and that's the mix that I've finished up with, and it kind of looks like ground bait, but if you sort of thumb through it carefully, that is 60% meat and 40% breadcrumbs. Breadcrumbs obviously effective. Chub love it. All fish love breadcrumb, and it's not offensive, and it doesn't conflict with the meat. So my theory today was that yes, fish meal and pellets and that sort of bait is quite a common thing to use for big fish on the rivers these days, but I don't want to detract away from the meat, and quite clearly it's been really effective. So combining all that together is a dead simple way to fish. Now, it's not expensive really. I'm probably going to get through 2 packs, so that's a kilo. I think if you were feeder fishing, 1 pack would do you, about a fiver's worth, and you only need a tiny piece. So I don't know, you could probably buy 2 or 3 quid of that from your butcher or in your supermarket, and you could put more straight in the freezer. So probably really a cheap way of fishing. So dead easy, dead simple, but really effective. So I actually hooked the bottom and had to pull for a break. So because we've had some fish and they're clearly not shy, I'm actually just going to tie one of these Kamasan 711 13s direct to my main line, which is 018 detection, because they're clearly not shy. If they're eating meat, I don't think they're thinking about the thickness of the line. It's passing by at quite a pace. I don't think they've got time to inspect it. But I've kept on that size 13, which in the 711 range, they're odd sizes. They're not 12s and 14s, they're 11s and 13s, and it's not a massive hook by any imagination, because my rule of thumb for chub, strong line, small hooks. And that, years ago when we used to fish the river quite often, if you wanted to catch a chub, one of the best ways when it was low and clear was single or double maggot on the smallest hook you could get away with. And I don't know if it's the way that they feed, the way that they take the bait, but you definitely got more fish. And I'm going to say you lost less fish on a small hook than you did a big hook, and I think that was the way that they took it. And the hook just goes in and stays in. They've got big rubbery lips, and when you set that hook, a nice small hook with a narrow gape, it were always like a B520, a B920. The old lads used to use Mustad 90340s, which were a crystal bend hook, i.e. not wide gape, and that was so successful. So I've gone for this, which is a slightly round bend, semi-round bend, but narrow, and it's clearly working quite well. This one is either stuck or it's definitely a big one, because I don't really feel like I've made any headway on it yet. Look at that, what fantastic. And this flow is what makes all the difference. If this don't make you feel alive, nothing will. It's doing its best to, I think they must shake shake their heads. And the trick with chub is to try and get them moving, because if they sit in that floor and keep shaking their head, eventually they have a chance of shaking that hook out. So I try and put as much pressure as I can on, because I've got that hook tied directly to me 018 main line now. A little bit more confidence because there's no knots. Which is not just about it breaking at knot. Sometimes if it rubs on some rocks or on some sticks, and this one's going to head for the margins, then there's a chance that it could rub against the knots and break them. So I'm leaning into this one a little bit. He's just feisty, but meat eaters are, and he's no exception. Look at that, fantastic. What a day's fishing. And what's interesting is that most of these fish have all been hooked in exactly the same place. In fact, I think they all have, which is right in the edge of the mouth. And I'm saying that one's been maybe caught by somebody else. Look, no, it's not been caught by somebody else, it's been lost by somebody else. Let's just get that hook out of there. That's been in there a while, rusting away. He obviously didn't tie his to detection, did he? Because it's broken. Fit fish. So I'll just talk you through the rig that I've set up for today. When I mentioned at the start of the video that I set up 2 rods, one with a 4 gram and one with a 6 gram, and I'll be honest with you, before I got here this morning I'd got visions of fishing a 3 gram float, which is about 5 or 6 BBs, and because I think the lighter you can fish, the better. Chub ordinarily, you know, sometimes they'll feel a bait and they'll let go, and it's a well-known fact that the lighter you can fish, the more bites you'll get and the more you'll hit, more importantly, because sometimes they'll just have a stab at it, and even a big fish that's gobbing a big piece of steak will still be a bit temperamental. Anyhow, when I got here, I picked up my rig that I'd pre-set up, chucked it in. First thing was I couldn't see the tip because there's a load of foam rather, and there's a lot of boils, and so that were pulling under a little bit. And what were happening is I wasn't in control of my float, so I picked up 2 rigs that I'd pre-made and put them on my rods, and a 4 gram and a 6 gram. And I now know that obviously by running it a few times that the 6 gram is the one, and that's because there's enough lead to control the flow near the bottom of the water and not just be fanciful and it looks nice. I can actually chuck it in and I can see that the lead is actually overpowering the effect that the turbulence of the boils are having onto my float, because of course the float is getting pushed around in like a washing machine effect. So especially a big float, so the bigger the float you get, the worse it gets. But I found the balance, and that's 6 gram. Now I've got that set up on this is a particular rod. It's a 15-foot rod with a little bit of guts in it, because obviously with a big float you want to be able to strike. I've got a 4,000 size reel on there, and on that I've got 018 detection. That's through then obviously down to this 6 gram float. So I'll start to the bottom end. I've got Camasand 711 size 13 on, really strong, not too wide, but not particularly a big hook. Chub are synonymous with being finicky feeders. They're aggressive when they're attacking, but they're not always swallow the bait easily, and a big hook sometimes they can eject it. And don't ask me why, because I'm not an absolute scientist and I don't know fish inside out, but over the years I've learned that the smaller the hook you can fish, the better. Now obviously we're fishing a big bait, but because I'm hooking it like a maggot style, I'm just nicking it through, that means I don't need a massive hook, which in my mind will give me more opportunity to hook fish. And all the fish that I've actually hooked today have all been hooked right in the corner of the mouth, which kind of proves the theory that, I don't know if they're spitting it in and out and blowing it in and out, but I've caught them all right here. So I think that small hook has worked. I did start off with a hook length, which was to 013 line, and I got stuck on the bottom, so I just tied a hook directly on the bank, directly to that main line, and I've had fish since, and I think I've had half my fish since I've changed that, so it's not made any difference. And I think strong line, small hooks is the recipe for chub. That's the general formula. So above that, about a foot, just over a foot, I've got 3 number 8, and I've used stocks there because they're easy to get onto the line, and they sit nice, and you can bunch them up and they don't spin up. And then a foot above that, I've got the Olivet, which in this case on a 6 gram float, this is actually a 6 gram Olivet. It's a Drennan one, fantastic Olivets they are. So the float obviously takes a little bit more with the trimming shot I've got on it and the droppers. I've actually trapped that with an old pole bristle, a really fine pole bristle. You'll find loads of them in your garage, where floats you're never going to use again. When we had them in yesteryear, probably won't even be able to see the tips, but they're perfect. And I've just shoved it inside the Olivet, and it traps the line, and it just stops that Olivet from moving. It just tight enough, but not too much so that you can't move it, but it saves it sliding up and down. And if you try and trap it with shots, I find that the shots move and it becomes a little bit messy, which can create tangles, whereas this sits down onto those little trimming shot there and it keeps it nice and tidy. And then I've got a nice thick topped bolo float. This is a carbon stem, and I think when you've got a big float on, carbon stem seems to be better because it doesn't interfere. All the weight is down in the lead, and it just allows the float to cast nice, and it sits and rides. As I said, a big float like this won't particularly ride the boils too well. The one that I set up that I thought would be fishing was a wire stem, an old Drennan Avon float, but I couldn't see the tip, and it definitely wasn't heavy enough. And this has got a nice hollow tip, and I've not particularly shotted it right down. I've actually got some of the shoulder sitting out, so that when it's going through the boils, if it's pulling under it, the float's not disappearing, because what I don't want to be doing is striking at false bites all the time. So the buoyancy of the float, leaving that little bit of shoulder stuck out, and a nice thick top. That's probably a 4mm tip, that is, and that's been great. And I've got that on 3 rubbers on the bottom. That's our 1.2mm silicone out of our mixed box, and then I've got a nice old fashioned Drennan stick float rubber on the top, and that is pretty dead simple. One point I missed was that I have a simple rig in with the droppers, and you know, you might say with such a crude method of fishing like what we've got today, thick line and the aggressive bait, I probably could have fished without any droppers. It's not a fancy rig, but I like to think that because these chub are darting around and they're snatching at the bait, I like a length of line between the big bulk and the hook to allow the fish to gob it and not feel it and spit it back out. But because I don't want that to be fluttering all over, that's why I've got those 3 number 8s, which they might feel, but probably not. It's not too heavy. So that's how I've done it, and that's worked really well. It's ridden it, but of course what you've always got to remember is the conditions won't be the same when you come or when you go to your local venue. So as I touched on, what I had in my mind, what I thought I was going to be fishing, didn't turn out to be the right rig. It wasn't the right float, it wasn't the right weight. So I think it's really important just to be a little bit open-minded and not presume before you leave the house that that's how I'm going to fish, because conditions change, the weather changes. You know, the wind's been nice to us today, but the flow hasn't. So we've had to upscale to make sure that we can fish properly, because ultimately if you're not fishing it properly, as in you're not making that bait work how you think the fish want it, you just won't get bites. But trial and error, obviously experience is a great advantage, but trial and error. But think about the fundamentals of, if you don't think it's right, then it probably isn't right, and that's probably the best place to start, in my opinion. So simple rig, nice and easy, and quite effective. Well, this is certainly pulling back after a bit of a lean spell, because lunchtime came, and I know for a fact that more flow came out of the outfall behind us, which completely changed the swim. The line of foam was further out, and it made the line that we've been fishing really, really boily. And basically we've had a lean spell, we've not really caught, and I've carried on feeding and trying to maintain the swim. It's took me a long time to get this last bite, because we're we've had a great session, and obviously we're bringing it to a close. So this one is certainly pulling back. We're actually backpedaling now. We're backpedaling downstream with it. My first thoughts were it were a barbel, but I can tell by the way that it's grabbing these edges that it's clearly another chub. Try and make it swim out into the middle, but we've had 6 magnificent fish, and 7's my lucky number. So if we land this one, we'll call that a day. But I have to admit, I were hoping to catch 1 or 2 fish. I were hoping that we'd get a bite, because it's not guaranteed. To catch as many fish as what we've had, and the quality and the size of them on float tactics, which, I mean, this is the sort of magic that really kind of maintained me as an angler. When I was younger, you'd come to the river, you're on a big wild venue, you're not sure if you're going to get a bite. I mean, look at it. Look how much water's passing by. And you're against nature. These fish aren't stupid. They feed and do what they want to do. And catching them sometimes is dead easy, and other times it's really difficult. And today, with a little bit of sort of wing and a prayer, that's another one that's in the lip, look. We've managed to have a fantastic day's fishing and catch on a bit of a strange bait. I've saved a bit, which I'll be having for my tea, and it's produced lucky number 7, fantastic chub from the Trent. It's a cracking day ticket water. If you fancy some sport like this, fish yourself down here. Ashfield Anglers Day Ticket Water at Burton Joyce. Chub fishing.